In 18th century London, amidst the stench and ignorance, lived a man named Percivall Pott. He was one of the most respected surgeons of his time, performing operations, teaching, and writing scientific papers. His name was synonymous with medical integrity and skill. But one day, he undertook an action that would forever change the course of medicine and the human approach to labor. He observed, he analyzed, he established a horrifying yet undeniable link between the soot covering young chimney sweeps and the deadly scrotal cancer they developed. Thus, Percivall Pott became the first in history to scientifically describe an occupational disease, proving that the environment could be a direct source of mortal danger. Then, something unimaginable occurred. His discovery became the spark that ignited a desperate, multi-year struggle for the prohibition of child labor, saving thousands of lives condemned to a slow and agonizing death. We are accustomed to imagining scientific breakthroughs as sudden flashes of insight, moments of pure genius born in sterile laboratories or secluded studies. This is a beautiful myth, but the truth is far more complex and often much crueler. Progress never emerges from nothing. It is forged from decades of painstaking, often grim labor, from a keen observation of suffering that most prefer to turn away from the courage to challenge entrenched dogmas and widespread indifference, from the ability to see a cause where others perceive only fatal inevitability. The story of Percivall Pott is not a legend of brilliant insight. It is a chronicle of struggle, a man's fight against ignorance, against indifference, against a system that ground up lives. And it is with this story that we begin our immersion into a world where scientific truth carved its path through dirt, blood, and centuries of ignorance. In the 18th century, healing was the privilege of the few, death the destiny of all. Medicine relied on ancient works and centuries of unchanging dogmas. Diseases were attributed to bad humors, tainted blood, or an imbalance of fluids. No one knew the true causes. No one sought them in the dirt underfoot. Diagnoses were made by the color of urine, the position of the stars, or by premonition. Treatment? Bloodletting, induced vomiting, cauterization, or simply prayer. Surgeons were more like butchers. They operated swiftly, without anesthesia or antiseptics. Open wounds were seared with red-hot iron or doused with boiling oil, believed to cleanse and seal damaged tissues. Pus was not feared. On the contrary, murky, foul-smelling pus was called laudable. It was believed to be a sign of healing that the body was expelling the disease. In reality, it was a sure path to sepsis, amputation, and a slow, agonizing death. In this world, where pain was the norm and death a daily companion, human life was valued cheaply. Suffering was taken for granted as part of the natural order. No one questioned why some people fell ill more often than others, why diseases plagued entire professions, or why children, barely able to walk, died from terrible ailments. This was a time when illness was a death sentence, and science was merely a pale shadow of superstitions and traditions. Truth was hidden behind a veil of ignorance and indifference. Yet, even in this world steeped in pain, there were those who sought a different path. Percivall Pott was not from a noble family. He was born in 1713 to parents without grand titles. His father died young, but his strong-willed mother ensured he received an education. At 15, young Percivall became an apprentice to Edward Norris, one of London's leading surgeons. For 5 years he assisted, learned dissections and dressings, and observed operations that often ended not in healing but in death. It was a harsh school, but it gave him invaluable experience and a deep understanding of the human body. By the age of 30, Pott was a recognized professional. He secured a surgeon's position at one of London's oldest hospitals, St. Bartholomew's Hospital. This was more than just a workplace. It was a true factory of death. Every day, hundreds of patients flocked there with horrific wounds, festering ulcers, and fractures that no one could set. He saw people dying from trivial scratches that turned into deadly infections. He saw children mutilated in factories and workers whose bodies were exhausted by unbearable labor. Traditional treatments, bloodletting, cauterization, emetics, offered only temporary relief, if any. More often, they exacerbated suffering. Pott, with his sharp mind and keen observation, could not help but notice this. He saw that many diseases defied the explanations found in ancient texts. Something was wrong. Something was fundamentally incorrect in the very foundation of their understanding of ailments. He observed patients not merely as a collection of symptoms, but as people whose lives were destroyed by invisible forces. He began keeping detailed records. He compared cases, searched for patterns. He asked questions to which no one could provide answers. Why did the same diseases afflict people in the same profession? Why did children from certain areas die from the same strange ailments? These questions haunted him. They matured within him for years, eroding his faith in established dogmas. He was not a revolutionary by nature. He was a surgeon who had seen too much pain, too many meaningless deaths. And this vision compelled him to doubt a world that considered itself knowledgeable, a world where suffering was simply part of the landscape. He felt that the truth lay somewhere nearby, hidden beneath layers of habit and ignorance. He observed, for days, for months, for years. Hundreds flocked to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, this factory of pain. But among them was a special group, children, boys barely 7 or 8 years old, sometimes even younger. Their faces were black with soot, ingrained in every wrinkle. Their skin was eaten away by it, covered with ulcers and sores. They were chimney sweeps. And they were dying from the same terrible, repulsive disease, scrotal cancer. This disease was unique. It affected exclusively these boys. Other patients, even those living in extreme poverty, suffering from unbearable labor and hunger, did not suffer from it. Pott had observed them for years. He saw how the tumor began as a small lump, often hidden beneath layers of dirt and clothing. He watched it grow, how it corroded the flesh, transforming into a gaping, foul-smelling necrotic wound. He saw their suffering. He saw how boys who had been playing in the streets just yesterday withered away, wasted away, becoming mere shadows of themselves. Their death was slow and horrific. No one before him had connected this disease to their work. To others, it was just another manifestation of an inevitable, fatal destiny, or bad blood that needed to be let, or God's punishment for sins these children had not committed. But Pott did not believe in such pronouncements of fate. He sought the cause. He saw the soot. He saw how it permeated every pore on these children's bodies, how it penetrated beneath the skin, into the folds, into the most intimate places where hygiene was impossible. He saw how the boys slept in the same soot-soaked clothes they worked in, how they ate without washing their hands, ingesting particles of soot. He began collecting data with a meticulousness unseen for his time, not just diagnoses. He recorded the boys' ages, how many years they had worked as chimney sweeps, how heavily their bodies were covered with soot. He compared their case histories with those of other patients, those who had no contact with soot. And the picture emerging from these records was horrifying and undeniable. Every boy suffering from this cancer was a chimney sweep, every single one, without exception. This could not be a coincidence. It could not be bad humors. It was a direct physical, chemical link. Soot, it was the cause. It was the killer. In 1775, Percivall Pott published his work. It was a small treatise, only a few pages long, but its content shook the foundations of medicine. Its title was simple, but its conclusions were prescient. Remarks on the scrotal cancer of chimney sweepers. In it, he clearly and unequivocally stated, cancer is not an internal disease. It is not an imbalance of fluids. It is an external factor. It is soot. He called it chimney sweeps disease, or soot cancer. This was the first scientific description of an occupational disease in history. The first proof that the environment, working conditions, can be a direct source of deadly illness. He didn't just describe the disease. He showed how it arose. He showed that it could be prevented if the cause was removed, if the soot was removed. This idea was revolutionary. It challenged centuries-old beliefs about miasmas and humors. It declared, disease is not a death sentence. It is a consequence. It is something that can be fought by acting on external conditions. This was not just a medical finding, it was a call to action, to change the world. It was the first resounding warning that the labor which provides bread can also bring a slow, agonizing death, and that for this death, spirits and stars were not responsible, but rather tangible, earthly things that could be studied and eliminated. What was his method? It was simple and radical. While others referenced Galen and Hippocrates, Pott observed, he didn't just see soot, he saw ingrained soot, he saw daily contact with it. He saw identical symptoms, he saw a sequence of events, he saw death. And he asked questions, not why is this happening, but how is this happening? He didn't seek mystical explanations, he sought physical connections. His approach was pure empiricism. This was science born not in a laboratory test tube, but in a hospital ward, amidst groans and pus. He didn't take things at face value. He trusted his own eyes, his own hands, his own records. He collected data. He didn't just record a diagnosis, but correlated it with patients' living conditions, their professions, the smallest details of their daily lives. He saw that traditional medicine, with its bloodletting and cauterization, only exacerbated suffering. He saw that the so-called laudable pus was actually a harbinger of imminent death. He learned from these fatal errors, from the thousands of lives lost to ignorance, and he learned not to repeat them. He didn't just treat symptoms, he analyzed causes. His genius lay in the ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos, in the ability to trust his own experience more than centuries of dogmas. He was the first to apply to medicine what would later be called epidemiology, the science of disease distribution. He didn't just describe cancer, he traced its path from the source, coal soot, to the affected organism. He showed that disease is not a divine decree, but the consequence of a specific exposure. This was an intellectual breakthrough that changed the very understanding of the causes of ailments. But discovery alone was not enough. The knowledge had to be disseminated, and Pott used the most effective tools of his time for this purpose. He did not write in Latin, the language of academic elites. He wrote in English, in the language of ordinary doctors, apothecaries, even educated citizens. His treatise, Remarks on the Scrotal Cancer of Chimney Sweepers, was accessible to everyone. This was more than just a publication, it was an act of democratizing knowledge. He wanted his understanding to reach everyone who could save a child. His influence was not limited to the pen. Percivall Pott was not only a thinker, but also a practitioner. He didn't just point out a problem, he sought solutions. He invented, he developed an improved trepan, an instrument for drilling holes in the skull, making operations safer. He created an innovative splint for treating fractures, which became known as Pott's splint. These tools, simple and effective, reflected his pragmatic approach, not just to understand, but to act, not just to observe, but to change. He was the embodiment of a new type of physician, as not a priest, but an engineer of the human body. He didn't just treat. He built a new medicine, brick by brick, based on facts, not fantasies. His approach laid the foundation for everything that came later, from hygiene to the understanding of carcinogens, from prevention to public health. This was not just a medical history. It was a story of how one clear mind, armed with observation and logic, began to dismantle centuries of ignorance, paving the way for knowledge that would save millions. Pott's publication didn't just change the medical perspective. It struck at the very heart of the old world, a world where diseases were punishment or miasmas, where the cause of ailments was believed to be an imbalance of internal fluids, and where dogmas had stood unshaken for centuries. And this world did not accept the challenge. The medical establishment, professors in powdered wigs, and doctors who had relied on Galen's works for decades, met his work with contempt, with fury, with open rejection. For them, this was not just a scientific discovery, it was an assault on their authority, their knowledge, their power. They could not accept that a disease, especially cancer, could come from outside, from something as mundane as soot. It sounded wild, unscientific, almost heretical. Their arguments? Miasmas, tainted blood, predisposition. They claimed the boys are simply weak, or their lifestyle is depraved, or even, it is God's will. Pott was accused of sensationalism, of trying to undermine the foundations, of denigrating a noble profession that, in their view, already knew all the answers. He was implicitly threatened. Attempts were made to ignore him. His articles, though written in accessible English, were ridiculed in academic circles. It's not cancer, they said. It's festering ulcers. Or, it's just dirt. They refused to see the obvious. They refused to believe their own eyes when it contradicted their entrenched beliefs. They tried to portray Pott as an eccentric, a lone wolf, but his data were irrefutable. One by one, patients confirmed his findings, and this gave him strength. And there were those who saw the truth. Not everyone in the medical community was blind. There were young doctors just starting their careers. There were those who, like Pott, were tired of the impotence of old medicine. They saw the results. They saw how his methods, not bloodletting, but careful observation and analysis, saved lives. He was supported not only by individual practitioners. There were influential patrons, too, members of the Royal College of Surgeons who valued his practical mind, wealthy philanthropists who witnessed the horrors of child labor and were willing to fund research. They were not revolutionaries, but they were pragmatists. They saw that Pott wasn't just theorizing, he was saving lives. He was teaching, he was achieving real, tangible results. This support was vital. It protected Pott from complete ostracism, from attempts to erase his work from history. It allowed him to continue the fight for the dissemination of his discovery, to continue demanding change. For knowledge, not translated into action, remains merely a line in a book, and Pott had no intention of leaving it there. He knew that the lives of thousands of children, condemned to a slow, agonizing death, were at stake, and he was ready to fight for them, to fight against ignorance, against prejudice, against entrenched dogmas that held medicine captive. Percivall Pott's struggle extended beyond hospital wards. It entered the streets of London and reached the doors of Parliament. His scientific works, his irrefutable data, became a weapon in the hands of those who could not tolerate children's suffering. One such person was Jonas Hanway, a renowned philanthropist who dedicated his life to protecting the most vulnerable. Hanway, armed with Pott's findings, launched an unprecedented campaign. He didn't just write petitions. He brought former chimney sweeps, disfigured and crippled, onto the streets. He spoke of boys whose bodies were black with soot and whose lungs were choked with it. He spoke of the cancer that slowly, agonizingly killed them. He brought to the House of Commons not only Pott's medical conclusions, but also stories, living testimonies of horror. He demanded action. He demanded a law. The resistance was fierce. Owners of chimney-sweeping companies, seeing a threat to their profits, assailed Hanway and Pott with a flood of accusations. They claimed it was a lie, an exaggeration, that the boys simply didn't practice good hygiene, that it was a natural risk of the profession. They were supported by those who resisted change, those who considered child poverty inevitable, and those who clung to old medical dogmas, unwilling to acknowledge external causes of diseases. But Pott's facts were ironclad. They could not be refuted. The testimonies of dozens, hundreds of boys dying from the same terrible disease spoke for themselves. Year after year, Hanway and his supporters returned to Parliament. They secured hearings, they brought in experts, they forced members of Parliament to confront the ugly truth. And so, in 1788, after long and fierce debates, after decades of struggle, the British Parliament passed the first ever Chimney Sweepers Act. This law was far from perfect. It did not completely prohibit child labor. It only established a minimum age of 8 years, required the registration of chimney sweeps, regulated apprenticeship conditions, and most importantly, made chimney sweep owners responsible for the health of their young workers. This was a beginning. It was the first but monumental step. For the first time in history, the state recognized that working conditions could be deadly. And for the first time, the state took responsibility for protecting workers, for protecting children. This was a direct blow to centuries-old notions of the fatal inevitability of diseases. It was a triumph not only for the chimney sweep boys. It was a triumph for Percivall Pott. His name, once ridiculed, now became synonymous with truth. His remarks on the scrotal cancer of chimney sweepers transformed from a controversial treatise into a fundamental work studied across Europe. His methods, meticulous observation, diligent data collection, relentless search for causes, became a model for a new era of medicine. The medical establishment, once rejecting him, now cited his works. His authority became undeniable. He didn't just treat diseases. He changed how society perceived them. Pott proved that science should not be detached from life, that it can and should serve to protect the most vulnerable. That progress is measured not only by new theories, but also by lives saved. His work became a cornerstone for all subsequent occupational hygiene, for the understanding of carcinogens, for the development of public health. This was a moment when scientific discovery emerged from the laboratory and changed the world. The path to the complete eradication of the disease, however, proved long. The 1788 Act, though a breakthrough, could not instantly stop the suffering. It only limited the age. It did not prohibit. Decades later, in 1834, a new law raised the minimum age for chimney sweeps to 10 years. This was another step, but it still did not halt child mortality. The final victory came only in 1875. Then, almost a century after Pott's discovery, the British Parliament completely banned the use of children for cleaning chimneys. Only after this did scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps begin to disappear. It became history, not a death sentence. Statistics spoke for themselves. The incidence, previously rampant among boys in this profession, sharply declined. By the beginning of the 20th century, this once widespread disease became an extremely rare phenomenon. This was direct, measurable proof. Disease is not fate, but a consequence, and it can be defeated. Pott's discovery also forever changed medical protocols. Doctors, following his example, began not merely to treat symptoms. They actively sought external causes of diseases. Medical texts began to include hygiene recommendations for professions involving dust and chemicals. Pott himself insisted on the importance of regular washing for chimney sweeps. This simple recommendation, previously seeming meaningless, now gained scientific justification. His work laid the foundation for a new discipline, occupational hygiene. It became the bedrock for future factory laws, laws that regulated working conditions, ventilation, and machine safety. Governments, inspired by the precedent set by Pott and Hanway, began to realize their responsibility for the health of citizens. Labor inspectors appeared. Public health committees were created. Medicine ceased to be the domain of individual practitioners treating individual patients. It became a public science. a science that protects, a science that prevents, a science that changes laws. Percivall Pott's discovery was not just a diagnosis. It was a call to rethink the role of humanity in a world where labor could kill and knowledge could save. It was the first step towards realizing that health is not only a personal concern, but also a public responsibility. Thus, the story of Percivall Pott extends far beyond a private medical discovery. It is a monumental parable of how scientific truth, born from the most abhorrent suffering, carves its way through centuries of inertia, greed, and stagnation. He didn't just discover a disease, he uncovered a horrifying mechanism where labor, providing sustenance, simultaneously claimed lives, slowly and agonizingly. This is the paradox of his legacy. A humble surgeon whose work involved healing individual bodies ultimately transformed an entire society, forcing it to accept responsibility for its most vulnerable citizens. His remarks on the scrotal cancer of chimney sweepers became not just a diagnosis, but a resounding manifesto. Knowledge is not a luxury, but a weapon capable of challenging established norms, breaking down barriers of profit and indifference, and compelling the world to change its laws. This battle, spanning a century, demonstrated that progress is not instantaneous insight, but a persistent, often brutal movement where scientific fact becomes a lever for social change. He proved that the deepest science is that which is not afraid to get its hands dirty in soot to bring the truth to light, that which serves life, and that which ultimately always prevails.